Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishna Nazir, Parak Zion, Chapter 7, Mishnah Beis, Mishnah 2. Okay. Al Elu Tumais Hanazir Migalayach. For the following sources of impurity related to a dead body, a Nazir will cut his hair. Meaning, as we've been learning, that if a Nazir becomes Tameh through a dead body, the Torah says he's got to cut his hair off, he has to bring a set of sacrifices, and he has to start all over again. Well, right now we're going to learn that there are certain types that actually cause him to cut his hair, which means he has to start the process over again. And there are certain tumas that do relate to a dead body, as we will eventually learn, that do not cause him to have to start all over again. The following list are the things that make him start all over again. Alames, for a dead body, for a corpse. Valkazayis minames, or for an olive's volume of the flesh of a corpse. That means if this piece of flesh detaches itself from the body, and you just have a piece of flesh there, that piece of flesh, if it's the volume of a kazayis, that is part of this list of the tumis that the Nazir has to cut his hair for. Okay, now there's an obvious question which has to be addressed right away, and that is the Mishnah said for a mace and for a kazayas of a mace. Now, if we say for a kazayas of a mace, all the more so a whole mace, right? So what exactly is that what is that first item of the list coming to include? So the explanation to that is, it refers, when the Mishnah lists a corpse, meaning mace, it refers to an incomplete corpse. And indeed, just to the bones of the corpse. Now, we're going to talk about bones later on in the Mishnah. So here again, if you're talking about bones, you got to be speaking about a certain formation of the bones, let's call it. If a Nazir becomes Tameh from an incomplete skeleton, and these bones make up a majority of the frame of the skeleton, or a majority of its 248 bones, the Nazir must shave his hair and start all over again. So there's something called the frame of the skeleton. That means there's a certain frame of the skeleton that's considered, do you call it the majority of the skeleton? Yeah, they call it the Reiv Binyan, the majority of the structure. That's what they're calling the frame of the majority of the frame of the skeleton.
As opposed to a side or
well, let's 1 second. Or a majority with 248 bones. So the way now they don't elaborate on this in the notes, but in the Bar Tanura, the Reiv Binyan, that means the majority of the frame is Shnei Shoikim v'Yarech Echad, two thighs and one leg.
Not the backbone.
Nope. We'll talk about that soon. But right now, the Reiv Binyan is called Reiv Shnei Shakayim, 2 thighs and one leg. Okay, which I mean, but it's one piece, right? It's one structure. So if you have that, these are, if you think about it, they're in a certain way the largest bones that there are, right? They kind of make up a big part of the person's body, at least the lower part of the body. So if you have that frame, so mace in the Mishnah includes that, or if you have a again, this is well, I shouldn't say that. It's the bones. Hold on a second. Indeed, just to the bones of the corpse, it becomes something from an incomplete skeleton. Well, that's what it says. It sounds like it's a skeleton, but incomplete. So if it's an incomplete skeleton with the majority of the frame of the skeleton, or a majority of its bones, if somehow or another you have this skeleton that's not the majority of the frame, but it's the majority of the 248 bones.
By number.
Then the Nazir has to shave for that. Okay, the Nazir has to shave for that. Okay, now, okay, 1 second. Right. Okay. All right, let's continue on. Kazayis netzel, the volume of netzel. Netzel is a liquid that oozes from the decomposing flesh of the body. If you have a kazayis of that, v'amaloi tarvid rakav, that is translated as a tarvad is a ladle. It's a certain type of ladle. So you have a ladle food of rakav. Rakav means dust from a decomposed corpse. Okay. Now there's something very unique about this about this tarvid of this dust. Okay, let me read to you. Like, this is very interesting. When a body decomposes, it turns into dust. If a tarvad, which they explain as a kind of large ladle, worth of this dust, if a tarvad worth of this dust remains in one place, it contaminates with corpse tuma. The ladle which the Mishnah speaks holds the volume of 2 average handsful, 2 handsful, which is not small, right? Now, listen to this. This is based on the Gemara. In order for a ladle full of corpse dust to give off tuma, it must come from a body that was complete. It cannot contain any dust from foreign matter. That's the halach about this. For this reason, the only way this dust ever contaminates is if the body was buried unclothed, meaning in a stone or marble coffin, so that the dust does not contain any decomposed fabric from the clothing or decomposed wood from the coffin. So for this dust to be considered like a dead body, there's a lot of specific details to it. But those are the details of this tarvid, this ladle full of the dust from a mace. Next, al hashidra. The shidra means for the spinal column. Vala gulgailes, for the skull of a corpse. These parts of the skeleton, if they are complete, cause tuma like the corpse itself, even if they are completely stripped of flesh. Okay, so that's the next 2 things. Va'al ever min aves, va'al ever min achai, sheyesh alav basar karoi. Or, if we're talking about the limb stripped of most of its flesh that was attached from a corpse or from a living person, if it has on it, as the Mishnah says, sheyesh alav basar karoi, it has enough flesh on it that is fit. Fit for what? That basically, if the flesh was still attached to the living person, the flesh could have grown back over the whole limb. There's such a concept that if there's a certain amount of flesh that's left on a limb, it can grow back. So if we're talking about here, you have this limb, which basically means, I'm assuming it means, one second here. Here, this is somewhat less than a kazayas of flesh. Had there been a kazayas or more flesh left on the limb, it would transmit tumah because of the flesh alone, as the Mishnah said above. But if it's a complete limb, it transmits tumah even though it does not have a kazayas of flesh. Okay, we mentioned it before, right? A kazayas of flesh. So in this case, you have got less than a kazayas of flesh that's left on the limb, which I'm assuming means the bone. And because it's enough for it to regenerate itself, then the halacha is that is like a dead body, that it gives off the tumah like a dead body. And the measure of enough flesh to grow back refers to both a limb from a living person and a limb from a dead person. Right? So if all I have here is that's going to be enough to bring about the tumah of a mess, of a dead person. So that's what it means. Val ever min ames, val ever min achai, sheyesh alav basar karoi. These limbs, either from a dead body or from a live body, that have enough flesh on it to regenerate itself, that is considered like a dead body for tumah. V'achatzi kava tzomais. And if, let's say, all you have is bones, right? The bones that don't make up, like we said before, they don't make up the majority of the skeleton, okay? But you have a half a kav of these bones, that, again, will be, that has the status of a dead body for impurity. V'achatzi loigdam, or half a lug, which is a liquid measure of blood from a corpse. Okay, so after this whole list is done, we say al magon v'amason v'alaholan. Whether the Nazir touches them, carries any of these things without touching them, or an oil or a tent is made over them, then this will cause him to have to start all over again, to cut his hair and start all over again. All right, that's this whole list. These are the things that he has that again, as the Mishnah says, for touching, carrying, which means carrying without touching, or making an oil, making a tent over them. The halacha is that this spreads the tumah like a dead body. The Nazir has to start all over again. Now, it's important to know that whenever you talk about tumah, right, tumah of an ohel, so we always look at that as if you're under the same roof, right, that makes you tameh. But it includes more things than that. Roof tumah is transmitted not only under a roof with it, with a dead body, but also by the source of tumah being directly over the person or object. Let's say it's above you, meaning it's the tent over you, it's above you.
Literally.
Yeah, or by a person or object being directly over the source of tumah. Let's say it's an open area, but you basically put yourself over it. So you make yourself a tent, a covering over it. That makes you tameh. So when you talk about tumas oil, these are the three ways that this tent tumah spreads. Okay? So in this case, we say that for everything on this list, these three things, he has to cut his hair. Okay? Now, va'al etzem kasa'ira, let's say I have a bone that's the size of a barley corn. Pretty small, right? So if you have a bone, but we're talking about here, right? It's a complete bone. We're not talking about a chip. We're talking about a complete bone. That's that small. Okay. The halacha is amagoy v'amasoi. If the Nazir touches that or carries that, that makes him tameh, like being tameh, like from directly touching a dead body, and he's got to start all over again and cut his hair. But notice that here there's no mention of oil, of tent, because when you have that kind of a small limb, there's no tumas oil. So there's tumas maga, touching it, carrying it without touching it for such a small bone, but no tumas oil. So were the Nazir to basically put himself over it or be under the same roof as it, it won't cause tumah. But if he touches it or he carries it, then it does cause tumah. Says the Mishna. The Mishna concludes, Al elu ha-nazir megaleach. For these things, the Nazir has to cut his hair. Umaza b'shlishi b'shvi. And because he has the tumah of a dead body, he has to be sprinkled with the para aduma water. On the third day of his becoming tameh, and on the seventh day of his becoming tameh. And what else does he have to do? After being sprinkled on the seventh day, he's got to go to the mikveh. V'seiser es ha-kaidmin. He cancels everything that everything that he observed, all the days he observed until now are canceled. He's got to start all over again.
From nothing.
Right? And he only starts to count once he becomes pure. He's got to go through the whole purification process, and he brings the sacrifices, and that is when he can start all over again. Now, one last thing. It mentioned before that the Nazir cuts his hair for a quarter of a kav. For a half a kav of bones and for a half a lug of blood. Those things he has to cut his hair for. So they bring down here, actually, even a quarter of a kav of bones and even a quarter of a lug of blood cause corpse tumah. Half the amount mentioned in the Mishnah can actually make a person tameh from a dead body. An oral tradition from Sinai, halacha ma'ashemi Sinai, however, teaches as regards to a Nazir, only half a kav of bones and only half a lug of blood cause another to shave. Meaning here we have a little bit of a nuance in the sense that even though a smaller amount of these things of the bones or the blood can actually make you tameh from a mace, and you can't do all the things that make you tameh from a mace. A kohen can't become tameh through these things. It makes you tameh for whatever things that restricts you from doing. But when it comes for the Nazir having to cut his hair, there's halacha ma'ashemi Sinai that says it's got to be more than that. It's got to be a half a lug. It's got to be half a kav. It has to be a half a kav of blood of bones and a half a lug of blood. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
On that positive note.
No, yeah.